Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name's Jason Van Shee, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of this podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we'll have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. Before I introduce our guest and topic for the day, however, welcome again to my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
Heading into the afternoon, Jason. We're on the homeward stretch now, so it's all looking all right. What about you?
For those who are tuning in on the video on YouTube, you'll see that Joelle's got a monster mug of tea. There is nothing else in that, she assures me.
It is tea.
If you're not aware, we're in a snap lockdown in Perth at the moment, hopefully just for the 5 days, we'll see. But I trust Joelle that she is putting in uppers, not downers at the moment. So.
I mean, I might be more interesting the other way. You never know.
Yeah, we'll have to do an after dark version of the podcast at some stage, maybe, Joelle. Okay. So we're all doing good. We're in good spirits, even though we're in lockdown. We know we've got it very good compared to the rest of the world who have gone through much harsher lockdowns than what we have. So thoughts are with everyone else who is in a much longer lockdown and maybe in the winter months in the Northern Hemisphere. But look, now I'd like to introduce our guest for today. He's one of Australia's foremost experts on systemic approaches to workplace mental health. He's on the Australian delegation for TC283 and the International Working Group for ISO 45003, the draft global standard for psychological health and safety at work. His daytime job is Senior Lecturer and Associate Dean, Equity, Diversion and Inclusion at the University of New South Wales. Welcome to the podcast, Carlo Caponnechia.
Hi, Jason. Hi, Joel. Nice to be here.
Yeah, really great to have you on,
Good
mate.
to have you.
Yeah, it's really good at ordering. I was mentioning to you before the show that, we're really getting the international flavor and some of the big names who are contributing to some of the global standards. So we had Peter Kelly on the Friday episode. We had Sapner on the Monday episode, and now we hear from you for the Australian angle.
Great. Yeah, great. Sapner and Peter are both on the International Committee for 45003 as well. So I know those guys well. Yeah.
Yeah, so we've been getting some insights from that, but it'll be great to hear from you today about, what's happening at a national level, but then also the work that you're doing at that international level and Australia's input into those important global standards.
Yep. That's great.
All right. Well, before we get into the work stuff, we like to ask you a little bit of personal stuff first, not too personal. Just so can you tell us some of your favourite podcasts that you like to listen to, Carlo?
Yeah, sure. I haven't been listening to many podcasts lately. I've kind of been trying to have a bit of a digital holiday with the whole work from home remotely stuff that's been going on for the year. It's sometimes been good to just disconnect a little bit, I've found, because I feel like I'm on screens all day. But one of my favorites is called Invisibilia. I don't know if you are familiar with that one. It's about, I don't know the tagline for it, but it's kind of about the invisible things that shape what happens to people. That doesn't mean it's about parapsychology. It's just about how people's attitudes, beliefs, sense of control might shape what's happening to them. It's a really good podcast, quite famous, and yeah, check it out.
Sounds interesting. Is that it? Nothing else?
No, that's the main one. I mean, I default to This American Life. Yeah, it's always good and lots of good variety there. A little bit of true crime. I did have a phase where I was listening to My Favorite Murder, which sounds terrible, but was really quite interesting. So a bit of true crime, where the presenters would take it in turns to talk about their favorite murder, a murder in the US that most interested them. Yeah.
That's an interesting take for them to.
Yeah, they were very successful.
To go with a favourite murder, yeah.
They were very. I mean, it was kind of dark. It's dark, right? But they were very successful.
Gathered, yeah.
They travelled the world doing live shows for that one as well. it was very popular.
I might check that one out. That might tell you a little bit about me as well. Okay, so let's talk about your professional career. Tell us about that.
Okay. Well, my background's in psychology. I studied basic psych, and I ended up doing work on stress. So my PhD was on stress and health, and once we got through that, I started working in a role where they wanted someone who had a background in psych and could talk about safety. So applying psych to safety is where I kind of started. I had a lot to learn then about safety, and I was very fortunate to have, and still have, a really great mentor in that taught me a lot of things about how safety works. And it kind of went from there, applying more basic psychology to safety applications. I started doing quite a bit of work on bullying. At the time, that was kind of the hot topic, and it's still a pretty important topic. I think now that we talk a little more about, more broadly, about psychosocial issues or psychosocial hazards, of which bullying is one. So I think that's kind of developed a little bit in the language. But I also started putting that into context, really, of human factors. So again, basically for the layman, it's kind of the applied bits of psychology applied to how people work in systems, be that a work system or a social technical system. And so that's where most of my work is, in safety and human factors. And the great thing about human factors is that it takes a core set of principles and can then use them across a whole range of domains. So you can be working in a transport system on one project and then moving to a healthcare system on another project, using the same kinds of principles, although the outcomes might be slightly different. The same principles still apply, and that's why I find it really fascinating.
Yeah, as a human factors specialist myself, I must agree with you.
Yeah,
quite fascinating, and I think that you can go as broad or as specialised as you want with it as well, which is
absolutely.
Also keeps it really interesting.
Yeah. And human factors is everywhere. There's human factors in absolutely every system that you interact with every single day. And it's hard to not go around and say, the human factors angle on that system would be to improve this. I did it the other day with an app, the apps that you've got to sign into at restaurants, and, well, in this case, it was a hospital. Really bad interface, terrible interface, especially for people who are a little older and might have dexterity problems. So easy to fix. The questionnaire that they've got on their app, it was just tiny and really hard to complete. So easy to fix, and it's a really good example of a human factors problem, just begging for someone to fix it.
Yeah, these days, we're working in the technology space, and we work with UI, UX experts, and it's really important to get that right. Otherwise, you get a flood of support queries going, look, I can't set my password, or I've been locked out of my account.
Yeah, and no one did the UX on this. And what happened is the staff at the hospital have to help everyone over the age of, well, I won't say over the age of what, but to help everyone to use this app that's just not fit for purpose.
Yeah, thanks for that, Carlo. We do have, people who, a lot of the listeners, I think, are younger in their career, and they do like to hear about kind of progression paths from, maybe university study into, different areas. And We all believe that psych health and safety is, an area that is in desperate need of professionals to, meet the need in the coming years. And so, it's good to see the different kind of avenues to getting into that kind of arena. You work a lot at the national level in relation to stress and mental health in the workplace. So could you speak to, how is Australia doing? What is the state of workplace mental health, psychological injuries, work-related stress?
Good question. It's hard to do a comparison though, because it's kind of apples and oranges. So I can kind of talk more about what's happening here. You've probably seen most of the stats on mental health compensation claims. So
it's probably worthwhile mentioning to the audience, because we have covered in other episodes, but they might not have tuned into those ones yet.
Sure. Well, one source of information on this is workers' comp figures on mental health claims. I'm maybe being a bit slippery with the language there, but they are often called mental health claims. They are about 9% of all claims and all serious claims in Australia in the most recent data set, which I think was 2018-19. So there's always a time lag in that data. It takes a while to get all the data together. So about 9%, I think that's the fourth highest category across all mechanisms of injury. Over looking at the trend, though, it is a category that has grown by almost 30%. I think it's something like 28% from 2000 to the comparison point in 2018-19, which is a huge increase. And I think that the costs have been something like over 200% growth in that same time period. And of course, that aligns with the amount of time that people have off work. So when people had time off work for a mental health claim in the 2000s, I think it was something like 10 or 11 weeks, and now it's 200% more than that. So it's going up in terms of the amount of time people have off work. It's going up, therefore, in the amount of in the costs associated with it. And it's highly prevalent among mechanisms of injury. So it's all painting a similar kind of picture that's all pretty bad. One caveat, though, on those data are that we shouldn't just rely on those data, because they're really limited. I mean, compensation data only measures people who successfully achieved compensation. And people who successfully achieved compensation are a subset of people who applied for compensation.
Yeah, that's right.
And they're a subset of people who maybe did have a negative outcome, a negative health outcome, but didn't apply or weren't covered by the compensation schemes. So those data are an indication. We shouldn't use them as the only thing that we look at. But they're not telling a very good story. They're telling a story that's having a big cost on organisations and, of course, on individuals.
So we are seeing year on year. Yeah, so we are seeing year-on-year growth in compensation claims for psychological injuries, right, since 2000. What do you think are some of the things that are contributing to work-related psychological injuries?
Well, the first thing that a lot of people will point to is, well, more people are claiming, and that's probably true. That's probably true. More people are claiming because there's greater awareness of those issues, and that they are actually injuries and that they're compensable through the workers' comp scheme. Sometimes compensable in the workers' comp scheme, and of course, remember that the workers' comp schemes are quite diverse across different states in Australia, and so the criteria in New South Wales are very different to the criteria. The criteria for achieving a compensated psych injury in New South Wales are very different to the criteria for a compensated psych injury in Queensland and other parts of the country. So it's not uniform. And it's not easy to get compensation as well, I should mention. You've got to that's actually something that's worth noting, that people think it's really easy to get compensation for a psych injury. It's not. It's really, really hard. You have to be assessed many, many times and tell the story many, many times. And you have to have, and it differs by jurisdiction, but you have to have a certain percentage of total permanent impairment, total permanent full body impairment. So I think the term that they use. So it assesses all sorts of impacts on all parts of your life. So it's actually really difficult to achieve that. But you're asking me about why are the claims going up? I think more people are claiming, and more people are aware of mental health as an issue, as it being part of health more broadly. And I'm not necessarily convinced that work is necessarily getting worse. I think it's been pretty bad, and there are some elements that are getting better. But there are some elements of work that are really quite bad and haven't been fixed, despite other aspects of work that have been improved.
Yeah. Are there any industries in particular that you feel are more susceptible or more prone to having psychological injuries?
Yeah, it's another good question. I often get asked that one, and there's a couple of ways to answer it. One is that there probably are some industries that we tend to think about being susceptible to mental health at work outcomes. But we may be looking at them because there's not necessarily other major categories of hazards to focus on. So if you think about white collar work, all kinds of white collar work, a very large proportion of the pie, if you like, if you think about the hazards that a white collar worker could be exposed to, and think of that as a pie, a very large slice of that pie is related to psychosocial hazards, which can lead to mental health outcomes. They're not necessarily being exposed to working from height or being hit by plant, whereas people in other industries also have those kinds of hazard exposures. So it's all about the relative hazard or risk profile, I guess, that an industry might have. So I don't know that it's necessarily useful to say which are the target areas, because, and I think this is really important, any industry that employs humans can have psychosocial hazards. Any industry.
Mm-hmm.
So independent of what tasks people are doing, what equipment they're using, how risky it is, whether you're going down mines or going up buildings or blowing buildings up for demolition, regardless, you've got humans there, you've got the potential for psych hazards. Unless you're employing, if you're employing robots, no humans, you don't have that issue.
Yeah.
But you've probably still got some humans because they have to control the robots, service them, right?
So it's crossed my mind that white collar work, obviously they're not going to be, falling off something or be crushed by something. So it's more the psychosocial hazards that are the biggest risk to their health and wellbeing. But if you look at Safe Work Australia's kind of breakdowns of, the serious mental health claims, you have your first responders, then you have school teachers who are one of these big at-risk cohorts as well. So maybe looking at something like that would be useful in understanding some of the more at-risk professions, understanding that in terms of total safety risk, that's the kind of the largest hazard for them as compared to, the bigger ones where, you're looking at catastrophic events.
I think it's important to think about the context of those industries. It's sometimes really hard to compare industries because they are doing quite different work. And one of the arguments that we often hear, particularly in the context of emergency services, is that, the work that they're doing there, while anyone else who's not trained in that field, who hasn't been through the exposures that people in that field have been through, would find that work probably quite traumatic. Many of the people who work in those areas have self-selected in. They've been exposed to a lot of things. They've had a lot of specialist training, and so they're protected from some of the stressors. They have, for want of a really old term, they develop a hardiness. So it's important to think about context, and that's, of course, one of the main and first bits that organisations are supposed to do in a risk management model, is to think about context. And I think it's one of the ones that many organisations don't do so well at, understanding the context that they're in and the context of the people they employ.
Yeah, and clearly you're not saying that as a cop-out for employers to say, oh no, these people self-selected into this hazardous work environment so they can get ill. Just to clarify that to the listeners.
No, of course I'm not. Thank you for that clarification. It's a really important one. I'm not saying that at all. I would never say that. In fact, there's really good work in emergency services that says that people in emergency services, because of those factors, don't find their major sources of stress from the job content that they do, the trauma, the blood, the guts, the gore. That's not what they find most stressful. They actually find more stress from the job context factors when they go back to the station and there's supervision problems and there's a lack of resources and there's a lack of communication and teamwork. Yeah, there's really fascinating work on this that says that it's not about the content stuff. It's about what happens in the work organisation that's most important in terms of psychosocial hazards for them.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to get your recommendation on someone else who can get on the podcast to talk to some of that research. That would be quite fascinating. Yeah.
Cool.
So it sounds like those first responders really just have the same problems as most people in terms of psychosocial hazards then, Carlo. Yeah,
they do. And they actually, there's a lot of really interesting work that's been done on this. They actually have a lot of problems. Many of them are working in paramilitary organizations. There's a high degree of hierarchy where you have to follow the chain of command. And there's also good operational reasons for doing that. I understand that. But it comes with some disadvantages as well in terms of what you can report, what's acceptable, comes with changes in culture around whether it's okay to take time off, whether it's okay to, experience a traumatic event and have some time off. And some of those cultural values are not evidenced in documentation.
Yeah, they really are, I guess, are they? You're not going to have in your policy, no, you're not allowed to have time off if you've had a rough week. You just have to stick it out.
Yeah.
So what observations can you share about some of the popular approaches to workplace mental health that you've seen?
Sure. There's a whole bunch of popular approaches. I think they've just in probably the last 3 years, this area has really taken off. Sadly, in many instances, it's taken off in the wrong kind of direction. There's kind of, I guess, two main popular approaches to workplace mental health. And I would say that they are, firstly, awareness awareness raising, and secondly, well-being. And, we should say at the outset that there's nothing wrong, ostensibly, with either of those things. If we maybe deal with awareness first. Awareness of mental health issues is really important. And workplaces have a long history of being used, if you like, as sites of change for health. Workplaces have a really important role in developing awareness on health issues. And I think a lot of workplaces have been successful in doing this around mental health. They've been successful in promoting people's understanding of what some mental health conditions might look like, what some of the signs might be, and really importantly, they've been good at normalizing the idea that it's okay to get help. So getting help is okay, and here's some resources, and if you need to, you should get some help. And that's great. That is a really important development, and it parallels a more general awareness that's happened outside of workplaces. So workplaces have really complemented that sort of social change in levels of awareness, which is fantastic. But, and you knew there was a but, right? It's not where organizations are meant to be working. That's not what organizations are meant to be doing. And unless they sort of ramp that up into something else, then they're really neglecting their duties. So awareness is baby steps. Most big organizations are doing it, but it's really baby steps. So come on, lift the game. You've got to do more than promote awareness. What do you have to do? What you have to do as an organization is fulfill your duties under the workplace health and safety legislation, which is to control sources of harm. Sources of harm are what we call hazards. Organizations have to control sources of harm to people's psychological health. I tend to prefer to use psychological health than mental health because it gets tied up in all sorts of inconsistencies around how people understand mental health. Most of the time, when people say mental health, they think disorder. They think depression, anxiety, mostly, maybe schizophrenia. It's far more complicated than that. And people bring a whole range of assumptions and stigma to that concept. So I tend to kind of not use that term as much, even though psychological hazards can have effects on people that affect their, what we might call their mental health. That can lead to a mental illness or get somewhere along the way towards a mental illness. It doesn't necessarily mean that exposure to a psych hazard, hey presto, you've got, a diagnosable anxiety condition. It doesn't quite work like that. There are steps in between. But I think I'm getting off track there, but I'm clarifying why I tend not to use that term so much. It is related in that it's organizations are doing mental health awareness, and it does tend to focus on disorder. And the other problem of focusing on disorder is that it individualizes the problem. It makes it about an individual who's coming to work with a disorder, and we have to manage the disorder. The organization has to manage the disorder, which is completely the wrong orientation. Because going back to what we just said about the organization's duties are to prevent sources of harm that might hurt people's health, physical and psychological health. So awareness can be useful, good, positive, but it's not what organizations are meant to be doing. So that, I think, deals with the awareness one. Is that okay? Should we move to the second one on well-being? Yeah. Sorry, I can talk about that stuff all day. So stop me. So
Carlo, you obviously you haven't listened to. I know you're on a technology kind of free period. We in our first episode we spent a fair bit of time on that as well.
Okay, right.
The fact that a lot of people treat mental health as a synonym for mental illness, and therefore if you extrapolate that to a mentally healthy workplace, it's one all about dealing with illness or disorder rather than, like you say, the actual duties of an employer or
Yeah.
PCBE.
Yeah, an organisation shouldn't be worrying about what mental illnesses people have. You just got to accept people as they come. And lots of organisations won't know what mental illnesses their employees might have at any one time or other, because mental illnesses change. You can have a mental illness that's untreated and then gets treated. You can have a mental illness that has onset and then goes away because of whatever life events or treatment that you might have. So we also tend to think of it as being really static and binary. That once you've got it, you've always got it, and that you've either got it or you don't. And it's not like that. So we need to evolve that conversation of awareness away from those ideas to have a more nuanced understanding of it. But coming to well-being, the well-being initiatives that are another popular approach to workplace, broadly speaking, workplace mental health. Again, there's nothing wrong with well-being. We want people to be well. The problem is how it's often used, and it's often used instead of doing the work to prevent the sources of harm that can influence people's psychological health. So where it's the only thing that organisations are doing, that's a real problem. And I guess the analogy that I often use for thinking about this is thinking about making a cake. And when you make a cake, usually you make the cake and you hope it's risen well and looks good. And then you ice it afterwards. The well-being programs are kind of like the icing on the cake. But no amount of icing is going to fix a bad cake. We could maybe argue about that. There are some people who will slap icing on anything. But you've got to make the cake first. Icing on the cake is frivolous, sweet stuff that without a cake is useless. So make the cake first. Design the work first. Design the hazards out first. And once you've done that, well, then you can do the wellness stuff because you'll be in a position where that cake can take some icing. Does that make sense as an analogy for that?
Carlo, I think you made Joelle's job very easy of picking a clip to put on LinkedIn afterwards. I think you articulated it very well.
Very good.
We need to understand, the things that actually matter before, doing all the wellness stuff, the individual focus stuff.
Yeah.
Let's actually think about what employees are responsible for, and that is creating a healthy and safe, wellbeing promoting work environment, not focusing on the individual and how much fruit they eat and how many steps they get.
And doing that through designing work well, that means designing those psychosocial hazards out wherever you can. And then you're in a position where if you really want to do wellness stuff, you can. Maybe you won't need to because you'll have designed such a great cake, such a great work system that you may not need it. The other thing about wellness programs that I don't think always gets communicated, I think employees know it, but organizations don't think about it, is how patronizing it can be to be told that you should go and, we're offering you yoga outside in the park. How bloody patronizing that is. when after you've, relaxed from your yoga, you've got to go back to the office and you've got too much to do in the rest of the afternoon. It's so obvious to employees when you just give them wellness stuff that you're not solving the problems. And I think organizations need to start owning that.
Absolutely, Carlo. I've often thought about that myself, where you get told that you can go and do a yoga class or go to the gym, discounted gym membership or whatever, but you still got to do your 8 hours of work that day, and then you've still got your commute, and then you've still got everything else that you have to do once you get home that day. So, what are you doing? You're just adding an extra half hour on top of everything else that you have to get done that day. So it's not actually all that helpful.
Yeah, I've had people report that they've been offered a massage at work at their desk, and they just feel themselves getting more tense as that massage.
How awkward!
Incredibly awkward as well, but they just get more tense because it's taking 20 minutes away from them that they could do some tasks to get home.
Plus, if you've got some decent friends around you as colleagues, they're just going to be making inappropriate comments the whole time about how you're being felt up at your desk. So, that's not conducive to a relaxing time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the problem with a lot of these initiatives, obviously, is they often don't get to the people who need them the most, because it's a person suffering role overload that can't take time out of their day to go do the yoga or, engage in a massage or whatever.
Yeah, and that 20 minutes will be better spent redesigning that person's work tasks.
Yeah.
Carlo, the other thing that I wanted to the other thing that I wanted to ask you about being a human factors person is the idea of psychosocial hazards as performance shaping factors.
Yes. Okay. Do you want to give me a little more context for that? So do you mean in the context of like an error taxonomy?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're thinking about if you think about a major accident bow tie type of a thing, where you've got your your control measures and you've got human performance in there as an escalating factor, and sort of the role of psychological distress or psychosocial hazards within that equation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, they fit perfectly as performance shaping factors in an incident investigation like that, I think. I think that the human factors world has tended to avoid talking about them as hazards, and in actual fact, that ignores some of the systemic things that are going on. I was actually having a conversation like this earlier today about how in our incident analyses, we don't always take account of the hazards in the work environment that may be difficult to identify from our traditional incident analysis techniques. And so we kind of need a bringing together of perspectives there, I think, in order to really get that.
So in terms of approaches to workplace mental health then, so you've talked about the sort of, what the more popular approaches are. What needs to change?
Well, a few things. I think that the really key change is to change how we view psychological health at work towards a more systemic approach, to put psych health within safety as part of our safety management systems that we're already using. I never like to have a sort of add-on system. I always like to make it part of the system that already exists. Organizations are already using systems that they're really familiar with to manage all sorts of other hazards. I'm not one of those people that wants psych hazards to be different and separate, want them to be part of everything else. I know there are others who disagree on that and will say that they are different. They're not that different. They're affecting people's health. They're part of a health and safety management system. So I think that that is a key sort of attitudinal barrier to break. But going along with that attitudinal barrier, there are some competency barriers as well that might need some development in order to make that happen.
Wonderful. Thank you for that.
Yeah, so obviously we've talked a little bit about now the growing nature of psychological injury claims, and that might be for a variety of reasons. We've talked about some of the deficiencies of the popular approach and some of the things that need to change. So what's happening at a national level to support, a more systemic approach to workplace mental health?
There's actually a lot of things going on in Australia, slightly different in different jurisdictions, but encouragingly a lot of work. So there was, of course, the Boland review into the model OHS laws, which basically recommended that what we need is to put psychological health into regulation. Now, I'm not sure whether that's going to happen yet. That's a big move. It's probably where we're headed. If I had to hazard a guess, but I think it may be a little way off. But it certainly put further action on psychological health in the context of workplace health and safety very, very firmly on the agenda. This has been happening slowly for 20 years, and the pace has accelerated just in the last 3. There's really nowhere to go. The train's left the station, get on board, or you will be left behind as an organisation. And I think that review was a major catalyst for that. In the wake of that, we've seen various jurisdictions start to commit to developing codes of practice on psychological health at work. There has been a draft developed here in New South Wales that's gone out for public comment. I know that Queensland are talking about this, and various other states and territories are as well. And if they're not developing their own, they're waiting to see what other states and jurisdictions are doing in relation to developing a code of practice. Code of practice is a really important document. And it has slightly different uses to an international standard and has slightly different application to an international standard. And we'll get to talking about the international standard in a minute. Significantly also, we've had guidance from Safe Work Australia released in 2019, so quite recent, on psychological health at work. Really important guidance. Some great inclusions in it. In particular, I think one of the most important inclusions in that was the material on return to work, because we know there's really good evidence about how if you've got a psych injury and you're trying to return to work, whether it's the same work or a different organisation, the outcomes are dire, really dire. And I think that is one of the topics that, as we really improve on psychological health at work, that's one of the ones that we really need to be paying attention to. So that guidance from Safe Work Australia 2019 was also important because it was tripartite agreed. So it was agreed by regulators, by unions and employers. And I think the significance of that is sometimes lost. We just call it a guide. Well, it was a guide with tripartite agreement. And while there'll be some who disagree with me, my kind of view on that is, righto, there we are, tripartite agreement. We don't go backwards from there. Everything else we do starts there and goes forward. I know there'll be some who disagree, who won't be happy with what was there, but it was agreed. And so I would always treat that as a starting point in our conversations. And I always encourage people, that's what we currently have, go and use it. Go and use that guide, it's agreed. Don't have arguments about this stuff. Use the terminology in it and go forward from there. So I think that was a really important piece of guidance. And certainly when it came to doing more international work, so the international work I've been involved in the new international standard 45003, we used that guidance from Safe Work Australia as a document that Australia put forward to the international process. And so it was considered when developing that new international standard. So I think in Australia we've had some really good developments recently, but I think also that to reflect more historically, we've had some really good work over many years in this area. Mostly from about the early 2000s, mostly that was concerned with workplace bullying. We had a lot of activity there in Australia with guidance materials, national guidance. There were some differences in some states, okay, but there was national guidance. And we were really seen as being world leaders in that, and we really still are in that particular area. As I think I said before, we're starting to broaden that conversation to psychosocial risk, where bullying is one of those psychosocial risks. So I think we've done well. We're moving in the right direction. There's a lot more work to do, heaps more. But I think we've got to consolidate some of the good work that we've already done, and some of that's happening with the international developments too.
So can you tell us a bit more about Australia's involvement in the development of that standard?
Yeah, so 45003 is a guidance standard that has been developed. It's in its final stages now, so it's coming soon, coming very soon. It was developed as a, so to back up a little bit, there's a new international standard on health safety management systems called 45001, which was released in 2018 and adopted in Australia as an identical adoption. So it's ISO, Australian Standard, International Standard 45001. And it's a standard for how an occupational health and safety management system should be. And it's been adopted in many parts, or many places around the world. And people in Australia are already using it and certifying to it. Some organisations, you don't have to comply with the standard, it's voluntary. But some organisations need to certify to 45001 for as part of their contractual obligations when they're going for contracts with other organisations. It's a really important document. 45003 is a child standard of 45001. And what 45003 does is it elaborates, if you like, on the elements of 45001 that are related to psychological health at work. So you're supposed to use them together. So that's really important. If you're looking forward to 45003, you should be looking at 45001. It's 45003 when it comes out. We'll assume that you've been doing 45001 and you need to look at them together. So it's giving you more guidance on what you should do in your health safety management system in relation to psychological health. So a really important international development. Australia's been very active in contributing to that new standard, 45,003. It was a long process. It was sometimes a challenging and frustrating process. These topics are have a diverse range of views on how we should best proceed with them. But so does health safety management. I mean, they had major arguments when they were writing 45,001 as well. So you could have expected that the arguments that you would have, the discussions, that you would have in 45,003. You see what I did there? The discussions that you would have in 45,003 on a psych standard would similarly be contentious, and they were. But look, I think we developed something that is really, really very good, and the feedback so far has been very positive. So I look forward to when that's available to everyone to look at. I think I'm aware that not everyone is going to want to use the standard. Not everyone's going to certify to the standard, and that's okay. Most organizations who look at it will use it as a guide. They'll use it as a bit of a check to say, what are the things that we should be doing in our health and safety management system to better manage psychosocial hazards? And I think that's an appropriate use of it. Importantly, I mean, I could talk about that all day too. Importantly, it also has some really good stuff about return to work in it. It has some stuff about emergency procedures. It has stuff about procurement. And one of the things in the later development of 45,003 that I think really started to become a theme was a desire to ensure that the clauses, because the clauses were roughly taken from 45,001, was to ensure that the clauses were explained in terms of how they related to psychological health at work. Because you can have a very bland, well, most standards are pretty bland, right? They're not very exciting. But I think there was a real focus on ensuring that we explain why we're talking about procurement in a guidance standard on psychological health. What possible relevance could procurement have? And of course, to someone like me, and probably to you guys, well, that's kind of obvious, right? But it's not obvious. It's not for all organizations how procurement can affect psychological health. And so I think there was some real attention to make sure that we really explained why. The return to work stuff, I think, is really important in it. We were at pains to make sure it was expressed that organizations, when they have someone returning to work, whether they have a psych injury that they're returning from or any kind of injury, they can be at risk of exposure to psych hazards, no matter what they've been off work for. The work environment for them has changed necessarily. They might be doing different work, they might be doing it with different people, with different supervisors, etc. Their whole work environment's changed. It's been redesigned. And so there's a bunch of risks there, both physical risks and psychosocial risks that then need to be managed, both for that person who's returning and for anyone else they're going to work with. So I'm actually really excited about what it says about return to work. I think it's a real development. And I think it's really going to challenge organizations to think about return to work and psychosocial health. And, it's about time.
Yeah, I was asked to provide comment actually for a HR magazine about, workplace mental health and the upcoming standard. And I think they wanted me to say, well, you're doing a great job, and you're not going to have to change what you're doing at all in order to meet the standard. Whereas in fact, we know it's actually, for a lot of people, it's going to be a lot of work to actually adopt those kind of principles.
There is going to need to be change. And I mean, I view it as a good thing that change needs to be systemic. it's not just going to be change for one person's role or in one little pocket of the organization. It's going to need to be change that's rolled through a system. And that's what it should be. It's an OC health safety management system. You should expect there to be change through that whole system in order to make it work for these new, I was going to say new arrangements. They're actually not new arrangements. They're actually not new requirements. So you actually go back and look at 4801, which is the previous standard. It was the Australian standard 4801 on, I may not get the title right, but it was on occupational health and safety management system. It actually said, you've got to identify psychological hazards. This was back in the 2000. I think it was 2000 or 2001. It was way ahead of its time. No one was talking about psychological hazards back then. And clearly, not many people did anything about it. That's why we're still here, talking about it and talking about this new standard. But I guess the point I wanted to make is it's actually not new. The requirements are not new. We're just more aware of it, talking about it more. There's more of a social impetus for doing something about this within organisations, which is a good thing.
And I'm for one I'm excited about the possibilities of ISO 45003 actually maybe providing the impetus for change that we need. Like you say, we've had so many good pieces of information out there for a while. I mean, if you think back to the UK, and Peter spoke to the management standards that came out in 2004, and the National Standard of Canada came out in 2013, and some companies in Australia have actually adopted the Canadian standard as kind of guiding how they manage psych hazards. So it's not new stuff, but maybe, once this new standard comes out as a global standard, particularly larger multinationals, hopefully, who already have 45,001 certified systems, will really take it seriously. And we can only hope that some of Marie Boland's recommendations regarding the inclusion of psych health into the WHS Act goes ahead at some point.
Yeah. And of course, many organizations will just be saying, oh, well, it's international standard. We're not going to certify to that. We're not going to worry about it. Fair enough. But there's codes of practice coming. And they're going to say similar stuff. And codes of practice will be things that you will have to be making sure that you're meeting those, I don't want to use the word standards, but making sure you're meeting those
the minimum recommendations.
Suggestions. They're not requirements.
I anticipate there'll be a bit of a lag. I got involved in human factors in 2007, a year after WA produced a code of practice for working hours. And there was a bit of a lag before organisations started actually adopting that. And I think that 5 years before there was a national code around working hours. So there was a bit of a lag for that to take place, and we're probably going to see something similar, obviously, with the codes around psychological health. Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. Well, there's obviously a lot happening both at a national level and an international level. So what are some of your hopes for the adoption of psychological health and safety, both in Australia and internationally?
Yeah, look, I think that my main hope is that we really do start taking a systemic approach. So going back to what we were talking about before, which is more frequently being a very individualistic approach, putting it into a system that's consistent with existing health and safety management systems. I think that's what I really hope is going to happen. I think I'm hoping that both codes in various jurisdictions and the international standard are going to really start making people think systems. It will take a little bit of time, and it will take changes to people's roles and responsibilities, and also their competencies. And it's okay to identify competency gaps. I think people in organisations should be volunteering to say where the competency gaps are. This is the kind of thing that your training budget, professional development budget, whatever you want to call it, should be being spent on. There will be competency gaps, so get upskilled in this stuff. It's not going away. I think there's great hope in that. But I guess what I really look forward to is, to summarize it, what I really look forward to is a time when we no longer have to say physical health and psychological health, and we're just saying health, because health, of course, as defined, includes both of those things, but we still don't think about it in that way, and people still need to identify physical and psychological health. And so I look forward to a time when we no longer have to do that, because it's just part of health. It's part of the systems that we're working in, that our health safety management systems are just designed to cater for all of the things that can impact people's health in a negative way. I mean, that would be pretty awesome, I think.
Yeah, I really hope to see that too. And obviously, when the Act was last amended, was it 2011? The definition of health was supposed to encompass both physical and mental, but I guess people didn't really interpret it that way, and that's why we're having to kind of come back again. So maybe we'll revert back to that at some point, the general definition of health, after trying to educate people around psychological health.
Yeah.
So, Carlo, what are your parting words of wisdom that you would like to offer practitioners who want to improve mental health in the workplace?
Well, I guess along similar themes. Think systems. Think about psych health and safety being part of safety. That may mean moving where it sits as a portfolio, and that can be really challenging for people because that means some change. But sometimes that structural change needs to happen, and some professional development might need to go along with that. So I think if I were a health and safety professional working in this area, I'd be thinking about those things coming up in the next little while. But yeah, it's all going to head in terms of systems and a range of different professionals working in that system to deliver a safer outcome. So I think that's what I'd be focusing on. Yeah.
Thank you.
Terrific. No, thanks, Carlo. Yeah, that's good words for the health and safety professional, or those kind of maybe recent graduates, or even still studying at university and thinking about, hey, I want to have an impact in this area.
Yeah.
Where's the area that I can kind of channel my energy and focus?
Yep. Sure.
Yeah. So, Carlo, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. We got a lot out of that. You clearly know what's going on at a national level and having great impact. So kudos to you. For all the effort that you put in, a lot of it unpaid hours. So you're doing Australia proud with, making sure that, the Australian angle is presented on the international stage. And it's really great to see Australia up there with the likes of Canada and UK in kind of leading the way internationally in this space.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah. So, so thanks, Carlo. And look, to wind up, don't forget, we do have this video on YouTube on the Flourish DX channel. We will be taking snippets and putting it online. So if you want to see those, we're on LinkedIn. So if you go to the Flourish DX page and follow that, you'll see clips. If you can't do the whole podcast and just want to see kind of like the 3 to 4 minutes nuggets of gold that we can pull out of the longer format podcast, connect with myself, Joel, with Carlo. We're all friendly people, and we like to broaden our network with like-minded professionals. So thanks again to the audience for listening in, and we'll catch you next episode next week.